When I first bought my 2024 Tacoma, I knew I wanted to modify it. Bigger tires, suspension lifts, armor, all things off-road. But instead of rushing into upgrades, I made myself a promise. Drive it bone stock for a little while. Now, did I actually have the self-control to really do that these past 8 months? Okay, maybe there were a few modifications here and there, but nothing big. I really wanted to first feel what worked. So from my daily work commutes to trail runs, all of this seat time gave me a better understanding of what this truck needed and, just as importantly, what it didn't. But now it's time to take the first big step. To really kick off this build, I turned to Icon Vehicle Dynamics to help dial in a suspension setup that works for the way I plan to actually use this truck. I'm getting ready for a big multi-day desert trip and I want to build my Tacoma for it. So this is episode 1 of the 2024 Tacoma build series, getting it prepped for its first real rugged adventure. Let's get started. I drove up to Icon headquarters in Riverside, California with a truck bed full of all-terrain tires, ready to break ground on the first phase of this build. Now, Icon is pretty well known in the off-road space, and among many things they do and products they make, they build very capable suspension systems. What's cool is that this is the place where they machine, build, and assemble their shocks right here in-house. And I actually toured this place last year, and seeing the process up close was honestly a big contributing reason why I decided to go with Icon for my build, but more on that later. Today, I had the opportunity to use their shop, tools, and most importantly, their expertise to install a full suspension setup on my 2024 Tacoma. So today what's going on the truck are front coilovers, upper control arms, and rear shocks. Now you all know, I love me a DIY install in my own garage. That's usually what I'm doing here on the channel. But working in a shop environment like this with other people, I think was a great experience for me. I myself just picked up a ton of useful tricks along the way, hopefully things that I can pass along in this video too. But anyways, this is Scott. You're gonna see us working together on the install here, but he was basically the mastermind behind figuring out how to dial the suspension in for this first phase of my Tacoma build. Okay, so we have a bunch of different components laid out here that we're going to replace the stock suspension with, and you guys are the experts, so I asked you what parts specifically were gonna go on the truck or what parts you recommended for my truck, but you didn't just pick these parts out of the blue. I kind of gave you some input, some goals I had for my truck. So one of the big things is I wanted to clear a slightly larger tire over stock, but the stock suspension, I just feel like they're a little bit soft. The ride just feels like, you know, it's a little bit loose. I feel like maybe there's like not a lot of up travel. Every time I drive, there's one spot on the freeway where there's a dip, and even on the road, I feel like the truck kind of gets close to bottoming out because the suspension's so loose. I don't know if there's just not a lot of up travel. So I wanted a suspension kit that would also allow the truck to ride better. So with that in mind, you came up with a pretty awesome parts list. So
totally.
Do you mind going through and kind of explaining some of the choices and what we have?
Yeah, so I mean, the idea with what you wanted to do is have something you could do in, you know, different stages, so to speak, right? But your initial goals are kind of the same across all the kits, right? Is the tire fitment and the riding better, all that, we got you covered with a basic kit. So there's no need to jump right into the really, you know, awesome parts on the high-end stages.
Yeah.
Let's kind of work our way up to it. So initially it was meant to be the guts of the system. Arguably, you know, your coilovers, your upper arms are very important. Technically they're optional, but they're so recommended that I consider them kind of a requirement. They make the truck drive way better.
And this is also for better adjustment, caster adjustments as well?
Correct. So that's why we chose the billet one. So we offer 2 different versions. We have the tube and the billet, and they're both doing the same job, but the billet arm gives you more wiggle room per se for alignment, and while that's not always necessary, it's super handy for a lot of different stuff. And so it's, you know, it's a modest increase in price up front, and so a lot of times they're like, hey, if it fits the budget, you know, it's not just a cosmetic thing where it looks better. There's a lot more function out of them. The diff drop here is required for all the systems, and that's to try to get more travel out of it. The front axles and the front CVs on many of the models, the TRD off-road is less of an issue, but they just don't like the extra travel we're getting it. So we're going to drop the front diff a little to make all that happy, keep your axles safe. And then as far as the shock package goes, we could have done a lot of different things. We initially were going to do the internal reservoir coilovers up front and then upgrade that later on, but we like the upgradability of our stuff. You can take these same coilovers and change them, several different ways and keep the same hardware, and really suddenly you got a stage 10 kit now. To give you the parts that you needed to do that, we started with the remote reservoir. So this will ride exactly the same tune, same everything as the internal reservoir. The only difference would be if you're working it really hard off-road, it's gonna run cooler. So in that environment, you could probably tell a difference in ride quality, but initially, same. So you've got the same baseline. In the back, there's not as much upgradability back there, so we started simple. We're doing a 2.0 internal reservoir in the back. Our 2.0 remote reservoirs would ride the same, but we're gonna have to drill extra holes in your frame. So let's just start here, see what you think, and then kind of progress through everything as we go.
Yeah, no, I'm very excited to see how this is all going to feel on the truck, because that's like the biggest thing you notice. You don't have to necessarily lift your truck and expect worse ride quality.
Exactly, that's our whole game really, is it's not just a lift kit, it's a performance suspension system. And what everyone always thinks is like, I want it to ride soft and smooth. You mentioned it, that's not really the answer, right? Stock, the way that these shocks are tuned, they're for the masses, right? And they ride really nice on perfectly smooth pavement, but the moment you ask it to do anything, it's not enough, right? You need a more aggressive shock to make it ride better. It's counterintuitive, but the shock needs to do more work. And like right now, with this guy, super soft. It is a variable zone shock. There's a bump zone in there, but it's really aggressive. And so that's how we broke our Tacoma. We're just getting really into that bump zone where it's super aggressive, and there's trying to do all that work in a very small amount of travel. Now we're doing more work through the entire range, and that's going to work better.
Great. No, I think this is awesome. I wanted to do something more than just a spacer lift to clear my tires, but I didn't want to go all out pre-runner yet.
Yes.
So I think this is a great happy medium, and I'm excited to get started.
Cool. Yeah, let's tear it down.
And tear down we did, starting off by removing my heavy-duty steel skid plate to access the front diff.
The first step before we really start with anything is going to be the front diff drop. See, we got two brackets that look very similar to the OE brackets, and all we're doing essentially is moving these mounting positions down in the front. So we're kind of tilting the front diff down.
Yeah, and that's going to help the suspension geometry, and this is what we want to do before we even start putting the coilovers on. And we really want to get those CV angles corrected.
Correct.
So that's why we're dropping the front diff.
Right. It's better to do it first, because if you try to put the coilovers in, now you got to force those CVs down. And so now you're it's not like dangerous per se, but they're running more of a risk, and it's certainly harder to do. So if you do the diff first, everything else kind of just slides into place.
That's actually really good to know, because I feel like myself and a lot of other people would normally install their coilovers, not think about the diff drop, and then realize later on, maybe because of vibrations or whatever, that they need to do the diff drop, and then it's harder to do once you have everything on. So
right, exactly. So let's get started. First, all we do, we're gonna take this jack, and this is just to hold it so that once we start pulling the
OE?
Yeah, all the brackets out, there's nothing holding it in place, so she's gonna kind of want to fall down.
Now there's 3 bolts holding each bracket in place, so I'm just removing all of them to take the OE brackets out, with the front diff still supported, of course. And as I kind of mentioned before, the whole point of the front diff drop is to improve the CV angles at full suspension droop and maximize the available front suspension travel. The bushings on the new kit are also made of polyurethane, whereas the OEs are much softer, and I'm told that the intention here was to help limit differential movement under load. One thing I wouldn't have thought of, but seems obvious in hindsight, is refilling the front diff fluid after changing the angle. Just like you normally would, fill it up until fluid starts dribbling out. Now we're bringing the truck up to a more appropriate Chloe height to tackle the rest of the suspension install. Before we pull the stock shocks, I'm taking one last look at these OE units. Functional, sure, but they definitely leave a lot to be desired. So time to get them out. We're starting by loosening, but not fully removing, the castle nut that holds the upper control arm to the spindle. And then, the part I'm always struggling with, separating the upper control arm from the spindle.
Swing at it like this.
Like baseball.
Like this? But I'm a righty, so it's hard.
Boom.
Dang it. Well, guess I'm hitting the gym more after this. Meanwhile, Scott is loosening the upper control arm bolt, which is normally a pain to remove. In this case for this truck, the turbo hose is in the way, making this bolt just difficult to access. But he's got a neat trick for that.
Rather than taking all that apart, obviously that's gonna be a pain in the butt, all we do is lift up on you put a jack with like a tube on it like this, right, on the body mount.
Okay.
You can see, drop it down, and see right in here.
Okay, so the body mount's right there.
Yeah.
You're jacking up the body mount.
Right, so basically you have a tube.
Oh, are you pushing the body up? Oh, and that's gonna clear.
That'll let you slide the upper arm bolt out. All right. More, please. A little bit more, one more pump. That's probably good right there. I'll wash it. Yeah, so you kind of just gotta work it out.
Ooh.
Like that.
Nice.
Okay. So.
Okay.
Good.
Okay.
Bracket. So just got to get it off the upper because the upper's going away.
Yep. And that bracket is holding the ABS line.
So now the upper arm can come out.
Now with the upper control arm out, Scott is tying the spindle to the frame to prevent movement. Now minimal movement here keeps the CV from accidentally popping out, a small but critical detail. Now I'm removing the one lower shock bolt. Cool. And then up top, there's 4 upper shock bolts.
There we go. Try that. Boom.
There we go.
Boom. Ta-da.
Easy.
Piece of cake.
Ding. Here's where things get interesting. So before we can install the new shocks, a little trimming is required on the lower control arm. Basically, the new shocks are slightly larger, so I'm using a grinder to shave off just enough material for clearance. Nothing extreme, but it ensures the new shock fits snugly into the pocket. And of course, you want a quick coat of spray paint to prevent rust, and then time to mount the new shock.
Fish it down in here, then drop the lower a bit to get it in, or other times it's easier to get the upper end and then drop the jack a little. So we'll kind of put this back up so it's in position.
So it's aligned.
Yeah, and then
that looks so good. So do you bias one side, like the passenger or driver side, for ride height? Like, because if one side's heavier?
Usually for the older trucks, yes. I would say that is the case. A lot of times when you set it up on the truck, you'll have different thread showings.
Yep.
But it really comes down to the truck. Like the 4th gens, like you can tell Toyota did a better job of weight distribution. 3rd gens and 1st and 2nd gen Tundras, like all the older stuff, everything leans to the driver. Even after it's all done, even when it's stock, like everyone always
the taco lean.
Yeah,
that's
everyone always talks
thing.
about it, but it's always there. You just can't see it because you're not paying attention. Now, once you put your lift on and you stand back and look at it, like, oh, looks good, and then like, oh, but it's leaning.
And I'm going to show you guys the final ride height measurement at the end of this video, but for now, we've got the upper shock mounted with its 4 bolts. Now it's time to secure the lower mount.
There you go.
Scott is removing one of the OEM splash guards so we can install the remote reservoir bracket, but only after getting the new billet upper control arm in place. Now honestly, getting everything lined up for the UCA bowl is a little bit tricky. It can be like pulling teeth sometimes. I totally remember struggling with this on my Gen 3 Tacoma, but this body mount trick makes a huge difference when it comes to having enough space to work. With everything in place, we're reassembling the new upper control arm onto the spindle and of course, torquing everything to spec. You just need to get enough to get the nut on, right?
Exactly.
Yep.
So it clicks.
Now for the fun part, Scott is mounting the remote reservoir using the hose clamps and brackets from the Stage 2 kit. What I like about Icon setup is that they include heat shrink tubing around the hose clamps for a cleaner, more factory-like install. Now the front install is complete and we're ready to move on to the rear. However, before that, Scott right now is just checking the hub rotation to make sure that inner CV joint didn't separate while we were moving the spindle around. Again, this was the reason in the first place he kind of tied it down. This is a good sanity check and one that can save you from an unexpected CV failure after putting everything back together. Now, onto the rear shocks, and I'm telling you, do not blink or you might actually miss it. There are literally just two bolts to remove, the upper and lower shock mounts. Fairly straightforward. As we install the new shocks, we're using the provided new bushings, and then when we want to get the lower shock mount bolt in, we're lifting the axle with a jack just to help line it up.
Higher.
One more, that's it. Yeah, a little too far.
The floor jack. Perfect.
And that's pretty much it for the rear shocks. Yep, way easier than the front. Don't forget to torque everything down too. I like these foam bump stops in the back, these factory ones.
They squishy?
Yeah, I mean, I think I only hit them one time, maybe. I don't know. Or
You have hit them.
I've hit
At
them.
least once. That's right, that's what they're for.
With the suspension dialed in, it's time for wheels and tires. These are 17-inch, zero offset, method 312 wheels, wrapped in BF Goodrich KO2s in the size 285/70 R17. It's bigger and wider than the stock tires, but not too aggressive. And as the truck is lowered on the ground, they clear even when turning. Now, first stop, we're not gonna go home just yet. What you wanna do anytime you mess with your suspension or change out suspension is go straight to the alignment shop first. Here's how everything turned out post-install. Honestly, I think the truck looks mean now. The zero offset wheels give it a wider stance and it sits just right. Now, I'll dive into the specific wheel and tire setup in more detail, basically just how I landed on this combo, in the next build episode. So all of these, minus the rear shocks, because I think I accidentally left them at the shop, are all of the OEM components that came off of the truck, all got replaced or removed. So here's a little bit of a closer look at the front OEM coilovers. You can see these ones feature a little piggyback reservoir up here in the front. Of course, we've got the OEM upper control arms as well. These two brackets came from the front differential. We replaced those when we did the front diff drop kit. I think these are like some plastic splash guards that kind of went on the inside of the fender that we had to remove in order to mount the remote reservoir on the Icon front coilovers. And then of course the mud flaps. The suspension has settled, maybe not fully settled because I haven't driven it a ton yet. But what I wanted to do, now that I think we're at least in a good place to do it, is take some after measurements. When measuring all four corners, I always like to go from the center of the wheel to the bottom of the fender flare. If you're measuring from the ground up, like what I'm doing right here, it can be inaccurate if your tire pressures aren't even. But it's hard when you're holding a camera with one hand and trying to get a reading from the tape measure mid-air, and I want to show you guys the result. So just for the sake of the video, here's the ride height that we're looking at. Yes, not perfect, so with some give or take, let's call it the Chloe error margin, we're sitting pretty dead level straight out of the box. We didn't add new rear springs if you remember, so the height gain was only in the front, giving us the perfect level lift. Now with these shocks, you can adjust the ride height, which I'll actually do in the next episode, and I'll show you how that's possible. But before I actually tweaked anything, I wanted to show you guys, in case anyone else is installing an Icon Stage 2 kit on their 2024 Tacoma, how the 285s fit up front. Of course, these are in perfect conditions, and yes, it looks tight, and we might get some rubbing when actually hitting dips down in the desert, but I will say after a week of daily driving, I honestly haven't heard a single rub. So far, so good. And that's the Icon Stage 2 suspension system, a big difference compared to stock. First driving impressions, well, the ride quality is solid as expected. It feels a lot like what I'm used to with how my Gen 3 Tacoma suspension is set up. And of course, I want to test it more properly by being on the dirt, but just driving on the street, it feels way more responsive and less floaty than the stock shocks, which I definitely prefer. But more on this in the next video. I just wanted to give a huge thank you and shout out to Icon for collaborating with me on this project, and specifically to Scott, Patrick, Dylan, and everybody else who made this happen. Thank you guys for watching. Hope you're excited about the truck and more videos to come, and hope I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.